Go ahead, Inara. It's begun.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anara Tabashaliva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Sherray. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any questions for our guests. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Dr. Katerina Shrey.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким покліном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you, Katerina. Today's guest will be introduced by Dr. Victor Fett.
Thank you, Nara. I am proud to introduce friends of our program who agreed to come today, but let me first say a couple of words. This coming Monday marks 3 years of full-scale Russian aggression in Ukraine. This is why we are here, and this is why we have been here every week for 3 years non-stop. This is our meeting number 156. It was said long ago that one who does not know history is bound to repeat it. 100 years ago, President Wilson made an attempt to impose an order on Europe's crumbled monarchies. In 20 years, Stalin and Hitler turned the tables. 80 years ago in Yalta, President Roosevelt allowed the communist dictator Stalin to take over Eastern Europe. Ukrainian fighters resisted until early 1960s without any Western help. Many of my Vietnam, but they surely remember how all free people of Middle Earth stood together against Mordor. This was the best analogy I used 3 years ago in our first meeting, and it still is the best. Ukraine is Gondor, fighting for 3 years, and President Zelensky is Aragorn, who refused to flee. And this was utterly unexpected, and the best thing, in my opinion, that happened to European history since the fall of the Soviet Union. I pray that in the next few days we will hear the right words from the White House, that Putin's Russia is an aggressor state, a worldwide sponsor of terrorists, including Hamas, that Ukraine fights for its independence, just like these colonies here did in 1776, that there will be no new Munich, but instead a new Nuremberg, that the only possible victory in this war is a defeat of the totalitarian Russia, the enemy of the free world. I will yield the microphone to our roundtable speakers, asking each participant to make about 10-minute statement, and then we will move to questions and answers as they come. Thank you, God bless America, and glory to Ukraine and its heroes. Dr. Clemens, please open your microphone and camera and talk to us. Microphone is yours.
Yeah.
Dr. Fett, you have given us a good start on history, but I'd like to add a little history going even further back. My subject is when the big two try to divide the world between them. In 1807, the Russian Tsar was afraid that the French were defeating his armies, and so Alexander I opted to meet with Napoleon on a raft in the river in Tilsit. And together they arranged a sort of non-aggression pact and agreed between them to pressure other smaller countries like Sweden and Denmark to join in a naval blockade against Great Britain. Well, that particular non-aggression pact lasted not very long, and within a few years, Napoleon decided to invade France, to invade Russia, and he made it all the way to Moscow. And after a short time in Moscow, he decided to go back to Paris. But when he got to Paris, most of his army had died in the snow or from hunger or from guerrilla forces that were shooting at them all the way back to Europe. So that particular Big Two division of the world did not work very well, didn't work for France or for Russia. Now, another time the Big Two met, and Dr. Fett just alluded to it, was in 1939 when Hitler sent his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, to Moscow. And Ribbentrop, with the Soviet foreign minister Molotov, worked out another non-aggression treaty. But that treaty also had some secret clauses that permitted Moscow and Berlin to divide Eastern Europe between them. As part of this deal, Russia agreed to supply Hitler with necessary materials for his war machine. Well, 2 years later, that war machine was turned against Russia itself, and the German troops invaded and almost made it to Moscow again. The war went on for a few years, killed as many as 40 million Soviet citizens and lots of Germans. It ended with the destruction of Hitler's Third Reich, and it took a long time for Soviet Russia to rebuild. So that particular division of the world did not work very well for Germany or for Russia. Now, I'm sorry to say that the United States seems to be attempting again to sort of divide the world with Russia. Why President Trump seems to have this affinity for Putin is hard to understand. A couple of years ago, when he was still president, he agreed with Putin over U.S. intelligence that Russia had done nothing to help him win the election in 2016. And now he seems to think that Ukraine started the war in 3 years ago, and that Ukraine is responsible for continuing that war, and that Putin is some kind of a peacemaker. So ideally, these two guys, Putin and Trump, might make peace between their countries and in some way divide the rest of the world between them. To me, this is an incredible malaise, and I'm afraid that in some sense, the United States under Trump is joining the totalitarian nexus of Russia, China, and North Korea. A couple years ago, I was writing about how the United States could resist that nexus, but now Trump is joining that nexus. He even thinks, like Stalin, that he is an appropriate dictator of what happens in science and what happens in the arts. He himself will decide what happens at the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. So this is a serious malaise. A couple months ago, Dr. Fett said he hoped that a new message would come from the White House. but I see no prospects of that happening. And it looks like a very dim future for the United States and the world. America had fabulous soft power, which is now being dissipated. Um, even our once friendly neighbors, Canada and Mexico, are alarmed and turning against the United States. So this is a malaise. I hope that some of our other participants today may persuade me that my dark forecast is wrong, but I'm afraid they won't. So let them try if they wish, or just add to the picture that I have sketched. So that's my few minutes, Dr. Fett.
Thank you, Dr. Clemens. We respect and we deeply are concerned as well as you. I will yield microphone now to Dr. Mark Thomas of Philadelphia, the friend of our program who has been, as I understand, Mark, you can tell us more about yourself, but I didn't say for those who don't know Dr. Clemens, his last book is called The Blood Depths, what Putin and CO, their subjects. He is a great expert on Russia and China, and was on our program before. Dr. Thomas is an expert in a different or the same field of counterintelligence and counterterrorism, as I understand. He joined us from Philadelphia. Mark, please.
Thank you, Victor, very much for this, and thanks to Marshall for doing this, keeping the light burning. I say about what to talk about today, and I heard this morning on BBC the Russian ambassador to Great Britain was interviewed, and he was going over the conditions for peace. And I agree with everybody that's come forward and said, what we're looking at now, we're raising the dirtiest word in foreign policy making, which is appeasement. And we have to figure out whether this is peace in our time, as I think Chamberlain claimed, or whether we're looking at the start of really a third world war in the near future for Europe. I'm praying it is a way to bring peace to the continent, but I'm afraid what that peace will look like. If we go off of what Trump and his acolytes said during the Munich Security Conference, I'm not very optimistic about what Europe will look like after this. Now, leave that said, the U.S. has been talking about pivoting away from the Atlantic towards Pacific as far back as George W. Bush, if not George H.W. Bush. And in some ways, the time may be right for that. The question is how much support then goes to, and how much support needs to go to creating a long-standing peace in between Ukraine and Russia. And there is no easy solution to this. And we were preaching back in early 2000s about the need to watch out for China and Russia, and overcome by the war on terrorism, we didn't quite get to worrying about Russia and China back then. I will say that the war on the West began in 2008. Maidan Revolution in 2013, 2014 accelerated it. And my biggest concern going now from the Munich Security Conference is what does U.S. support to NATO look like? What does U.S. support for Ukraine look like? And I want to think that what the current administration is doing is part of Trump's grand strategy. It's my hope, I'm not sure it's true, that his grand strategy here is this bluster in the upfront is to try to bring people to the negotiating table in a friendly manner, calling Zelensky a dictator or an authoritarian is totally out of context. Blaming the war on Ukraine is totally out of context. I think the deal with Ukraine for rare minerals or the rare minerals, um, could have some potential. I think if Zelensky's terms were to be met, which was, we'll help rebuild Ukraine through building trade on the rare minerals that are within Ukraine yet. In exchange, Ukraine would ideally get, according to what Zelensky wants, would be a security guarantee. Now, the conditions for the Russians to get peace are not favorable. If we go back to the basic idea of what Russia really wants, I guess in Putin's world, rebuilding of the former Soviet Empire, the minimal, they would like a buffer zone between them and potential aggressors. I could tell you, I think about at length of what makes a country an aggressor. There was a brief period in the 90s that many of us probably remember when Russia was friendly with Ukraine, and that we had cooperative programs, but there's always that bit of uncertainty about which direction Russia would go. So there's always a little bit of uncertainty with NATO how to treat them. For that matter, there's the Russia-Ukraine dialogue. We agreed on the Budapest Convention to protect Ukraine, as did Russia. But Maidan kind of tips that over. We could go back and blame, and there's put some onus on U.S. decisions back in the 2000s for why Putin's aggressive now. Russia would only need a buffer zone if they felt threatened, and if NATO really was threatening. So that argument of why they need Ukraine as a buffer zone is kind of flimsy. It only works if we assume Ukraine is the aggressor, which has never been the case, nor is NATO the aggressor in this situation. The other thing I think about what is going to be what Putin wants or Russia wants, and I want to think it's just Putin and a handful of his acolytes, is transit rights for oil through Ukraine. Brought a great deal of money to Russia to fill their coffers. The other thing that Russia really wants, and it was only discovered shortly before Maidan, was there is some oil and gas resources off of Crimea that Russia very much wants. So in terms of what the peace could look like, I hesitate to think, but it's highly likely, despite all the propaganda, that we're going to have to face the fact that the new Berlin Wall cuts through the Donbass and down through Crimea, at least until there's a change of regime or we get somebody like Gorbachev in power in Russia, sees the benefit of renewing relations with the U.S. It looks like to me from where Putin and Trump are playing, I think Trump wants to play the Russia hand against China, at least strengthen ourselves. In the long term, the vision isn't very wise, because when we break the norm of standing up for people who've been invaded, we then open up Taiwan for invasion by the Chinese. That said, as I look at what Russia's doing now, in terms of negotiating, if we look at their military doctrine, foreign policy, part of the strategy is to use hybrid warfare being both cyber attacks. I recently saw in the German press that Germans are blaming the terrorist attack in Munich, linking it back to Russian intelligence, provoking this individual to do the attack, and pretending to be a Islamic fundamentalist or a fundamentalist claiming association with Islam, if I can use my NATO terminology, and therefore trying to undermine and try to get people into power within Germany who are more favorable to Russia's end. But also is trying to shape the arena or shape the peace to their favor. And that would mean both manipulating the news, but also putting out things which cause shock and awe, enough to make people want to change their diplomatic positions or change what they want for concessions. If I were to list what Putin wants going into the peace talks, one, he'll want to keep what he took. Two, he's going to want a guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO, a guarantee that Zelensky will step down from power, and he'd probably like to see Yanukovych come back to power. And then ultimately, I heard the complaint that Ukraine had banned the Russian language. As far as I remember, it's not banned. It's not the official language. It can't be diversity level. It can still be spoken. With that said, people I've talked to from Ukraine who've come over are no big rush to keep Russian as their native language. Partially as a rejection of the poverty in which Russians live and which they don't want to live, and an orientation towards Europe. On a positive note, it hasn't put off allowing Ukraine to join the European Union. That may be a problem, but he hasn't said no yet. And to that, the European Union, for what exists of European defense policy, could kind of link Ukraine then to Western Europe, what's left of Ukraine to Western Europe. I don't think personally that this is the end of Russian aggression. I know I'm going all over the place on this, but there's a little place called Kaliningrad on the other side of Lithuania and Poland, which Russia needs access to. Right now, it doesn't have direct access. So that if I were in any of the three Baltic states or Poland, I would start worrying about what Putin is salivating over between essentially Suwalki Gap to get to Kaliningrad and open up. It wouldn't make sense just to take the gap. It'd mean to take a broader stretch of territory. So we're looking, as I think everybody else has mentioned, a new Yalta. And the question is, what do the Ukrainians want? And it's pretty clear based on recent opinion polls, which came out within the past week. Zelensky's policy is about a 57% approval rating, despite Trump saying he's down in single digits for approval. I think we're having a lot of smoke blown up in our faces to try to confuse us, which is part of the overall plan to kind of make negotiations seem a little bit more too difficult. Therefore, let's just end the war and end the fighting. As a former soldier, I'm naturally very in favor of ending fighting, but that's not my role here. My role is to, if the Ukrainians want to keep fighting, then we should stand beside them. With that said, I will close out my comments. Not sure if I've gotten 10 minutes or over, but I will end there.
Thank you, Mark. This is very, very informative, very sober, and if any historic analogies work, we are not even in 1938, we are in 1940, looking at Finnish Stalin situation and attack on Helsinki. But we all know that historical analogies do not completely work. And as we're waiting on our third speaker, who is not yet here, I believe we probably need to take questions or comments to Dr. Clemens or Dr. Thomas. Please, go ahead. Anyone? Dr. Deutsch, please. Dr. Deutsch is our former graduate dean of Marshall University and a great friend of our program. Please, Leonard.
Hi, Dr. Mark Thomas. You made an intriguing comment when you said that Trump is playing his hand with Russia against China. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, if we go back to thinking about how Nixon played the China card against Russia to kind of weaken the communist bloc, a lot of the closeness between the two, trying to warm up to. Right now, China and Russia are very close. In fact, the renminbi or the yuan, whatever you want to call it, is becoming almost a global reserve currency between Russia and China. And that would threaten the US dollar as a reserve currency. Why does that matter as a reserve currency? Because not only does most of the trade in the world, because the dollar is so trusted, is done through US dollars, which means a lot of dollars flow through the US. As those dollars flow through the US, it allows us to use our ability to block funding and to sanction different corporations. So in that way, the dollar is very powerful. Trump wants to turn Russia to our favor, break up that alliance, which reduces the power of the renminbi, the Chinese currency. and then open that up. We also, by winning Russia over, I'm not sure, this is kind of gambling with the devil. This is like Molotov and Ribbentrop talking to each other. By pulling Russia over a little bit away from China, we may be able to gain some influence over what would happen in North Korea, and then hopefully have Russia sit out if something happens in Taiwan. Russia's never been a strong Pacific power, so their interest is always towards the West, Western part, like Western Europe, and not towards Asia so much. So, natural way to pull them over. Does that make sense? So it's
A very intriguing perspective. Yeah.
Thank you, Len. Please open your microphones if you want, or raise your hand electronically if you want to comment. Anyone? Please. Still have plenty of time, and we're waiting on our third speaker to join. So I understand that history now is changing by the second. We're now in kind of quantum foam, and we don't know what is true. My question to both of the speakers, just informationally, have you seen the alleged report from Finnish member of Euro Parliament that allegedly America gave Europe 3 weeks to make some kind of agreement with Russia, or they will withdraw the troops? I'm not sure it is a fake. Mark?
Yeah, I haven't seen a report or where it came from.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
There was a name, the name under it. It was a message from Finnish representative to Europe Parliament. Okay, in this same vein, what can you say about European conference? I think Macron calls already the second one. Has anything been said of substance?
No, I saw that Macron and they're at talk and try to figure out a policy for Europe. In some ways, we've always been afraid of a European pillar within NATO. And there's that old saying, why do we have NATO? Well, to keep the Russians out, keep the Americans in, and keep the Germans down. Well, if Europe is standing up and saying, hey, we need to stand up for ourselves to a certain extent, and in some ways I agree with the Trump administration that Europe is underspent on defense. But that said, what role should Europe play? And again, it is a European problem. And when you think about that Finnish member of the European Parliament, I'd like to know what party he's from within the European Parliament. Plenty of rightists in the European Parliament. I would love to make peace with Putin, or very pro-Russian. Now, I'm not sure the difference between pro-Russian and those who are being played to get peace. There's very common to our Vietnam War for the two to get intermingled together. So same thing with Europe. Right now, German elections are coming up. Those German elections are going to be critical because the off day, the far right is not far behind. It's almost neck and neck with the Greens, and that's kind of why Vance was trying to say loosen up on free speech in Germany and consider negotiating with the off day to put them into government. It'd be a sad day in Europe when the German far right becomes part of the German government. So we'll see what happens with European defense within that with regard. We'll see. I'm very not optimistic about what Europe could do to negotiate the peace. Will never be acknowledged it's a European problem. Europeans feel stronger about this than Americans do. You look at the polls.
Oh, yes. Obviously, thank you. Dr. Clemens, a question to you as an expert on China, if you wish to answer. China has been unusually quiet last days. Do we miss something from their side, or they're just sitting on this proverbial bank? Okay. I don't think Dr. Clemens is with us. Okay, does anyone else have a question or a comment? Katerina, please.
Okay.
Oh, no, please, Dr. Clemens, please go ahead. I'll come back in. Oh, you're muted.
Unmute your microphone, please, Dr. Clemens. Now you're, no? Again? Yeah. Again? Yes.
Okay. The long-term prospects for a Russia-China partnership are poor, I think. For hundreds of years, they have been hassling sometimes fighting each other over their borders. Their cultures are profoundly different. They have for now, a convenient alliance against a common enemy, the United States, but that alliance, I think, is pretty fragile. China, when I was a student in Moscow in the 1950s, I found that Russians had a great respect for the Chinese who were also studying in in Russia. They found that in the first year, the Chinese learned Russian. The second year, they learned some technology. The third year, they improved on that technology. But that respect did not include affection. The Chinese kept to themselves. They regarded the Russians as sort of barbarian, and the Russians didn't have much respect for the Chinese, who, when I was there, were practicing hand grenade throwing and talking about liberating Taiwan. They refused to talk to me until they said Taiwan is part of China again. I'm not up on what Chinese have said about Russia in the last couple days, but I think the long-term prospects are not good, and the United States might be able to dislodge this partnership. But I think it's better if the Americans stay out of it and let the partnership disintegrate by itself without any help from us, which might even help to continue that partnership.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
But let me add something to
yes, sure.
what Dr. Thomas a little while ago rightly said, that Russia's emphasis has been to look westward, but they certainly have devoted a lot of time and resources to looking eastward. And their first big war in the past century was with Japan over Korea. The Russians wanted to take Korea, and the Japanese wanted to stop them, and did. And so that if you look at Russian literature and some of their films, there's quite a bit of attention to the Far East. And so I think we should not understate Russia's interest in Asia.
Victor, could I add to this? And I agree wholeheartedly with Dr. Clemens.
Absolutely, yes, please.
Yeah, Russia and China have actually fought more border wars in recent years than they fought with the West by far. And there's that alliance is I actually think China is a senior partner in this. And there's jokes in Europe about eventually someday that the Chinese will make end a border dispute with Finland. It's a longer joke, but Chinese have a much longer term, longer vision about what they want with Russia. They want Russia for the resources. They want that Silk Road established. I wholeheartedly agree that the alliance is fragile, which is why I think that the U.S. might be able to break it. In recent days, China has been very quiet. Say they're in favor of the peace process, which has kind of been where they've been at ever since the war began. They won't stand up with the West against the aggression, but they won't oppose Russia either. They'll just kind of balance in the middle. Sometimes in a balanced power situation, that's the best position to be, because you hold the balance in your hands. So I don't want to mistake that China is a serious problem in global and strategic way. So, but I agree wholeheartedly with Dr. Clemens. So hopefully we haven't differed too dramatically on what we think of this alliance, the future of those Russia Chinese relations.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question in the chat from Dr. Somerville, our former dean, probably to both of you. If Trump withdraws the US from NATO, can this alliance stand or a new alliance take its place? If so, could this new NATO invite Ukraine to join? Dr. Thomas?
Well, President Trump doesn't have the power to withdraw us from NATO. If Congress is going to stand up, he doesn't have the power to do that. But let's assume the Republican Congress and Trump agree to pull us out. Could Europe stand up for itself? It doesn't have one thing. They could have nuclear weapons. Right? UK, France, both have nuclear weapons. Germany has the capability to develop them. Also, Czech Republic has the capability of developing them. The question would be whether we'd want that, because ultimately that's what you need to keep back the billion-man Russian army. Don't want to underestimate or overstate their strength. I exaggerate by saying a billion-man army. But Russian doctrine has always been to sacrifice as much manpower as they need to get their mission accomplished. It's been like that since the Cold War. Even I think probably back in Napoleon, throw manpower at it, and eventually overcome manpower of the other countries. If we were to pull out, I do believe that you mentioned Wilson early on and kind of our isolationism up to the Nazi invasion of Poland, or actually until Pearl Harbor, but our leanings and our final involvement in global affairs in 1941. If we pull out, we'll be backing eventually. So there's not a European country strong enough, manpower-wise, that's willing to stand up. And whether they can come to a separate peace, whether Europe will come to a separate peace with Russia, and there is that going back to cheaper Russian oil, gas they're getting right now. Depends how mercenary Europeans are going to be in this. And could Ukraine come into the West? That'd be very much along. If we pull out, that might be the end of the backbone for us to stand up against, for the Europeans to stand up against Russia. It's easy to have a good backbone when there's somebody telling you to have a backbone. Not to say that the Poles aren't afraid, the Latvians, Lithuanians, they're very much afraid. I think when I looked at opinion polls, Bulgarians somewhat, Hungarians not so much. Austria sits in the middle. As long as they get the oil and gas, they'd be very happy. So depends what pressures go on to the economies of Europe about how long they'll stand up, and then Ukraine would just be part of that European conglomeration. May bring peace to the continent. May not be in the terms that we understand today or what we want, but there could be a form of peace, but it would not be the type of peace I'd like to see, and I'm not sure how long it will last. Given what could be with human rights abuses, oppression, but we're in a very fragile era right now, both in the US and abroad, about what democracy looks like.
Let me add a couple thoughts
Yes.
about all this. The paradox is that Europe as a whole has a GDP much, much larger than Russia's, and yet they are not able to, they have not mobilized their resources to cope effectively with any kind of a challenge from the outside. And they have relied very much on the U.S. for their security since since after World War II. One thing that explains all of this is something called the logic of collective action. And that logic is the weaker parties should depend on the strongest party to do everything. The weaker parties, and that is Europe compared to the US, should rely on the stronger party, the US, to do their work for them. This produces a sort of parasitic logic. Let us depend on somebody else to do our work. So this has been a problem for a long time. Other US presidents have recognized it, but Trump is really underscoring this contrast that Europe is spending most of them are spending 2% or just a little more of GDP on defense. The US claims that it's spending just over 3% on defense, but by my reckoning, the US is spending 6 to 7% of GDP on defense. How do I get that much larger percentage? I'm including all the research on nuclear weapons, all the effort that goes into space research and exploration, care for veterans who got hurt in previous wars, paying the interest on debts incurred in previous wars. So a lot of these expenditures are real, and yet they do not help very much with the current problems of the United States. But anyway, the Americans are, not spending more on social stuff, in part because their real output, their expenditures on defense are taking a very large part of America's GDP. So this is a contradiction among these allies, the United States and Europe. It exists also between the US and Japan. And the idea of if the US were to withdraw from NATO, that would be catastrophic for resistance to Russia. And Russia, the weaker party, would be expanding at the expense of the free world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clemens. Thank you for the comments. Please, more questions or comments from our guests and panel, please. And Katerina, please.
I'm not sure where I'm going with this question. It's just been such a horrible week for Ukrainians and being sidelined in any conversation about Ukraine's future. We've had plenty of guests on our program who've reminded us that ultimately Ukraine will decide Ukraine's future. It won't be decided by an outside party. But it's feeling less and less like that. And I really appreciate the sobering accounts of Dr. Clemens and Dr. Thomas right now, especially, Mark, your reference to the possibility of a new Berlin Wall. I mean, that's just heartbreaking. The President Trump sent out a tweet yesterday or maybe before yesterday, in which he talked about how essentially Zelensky started fooled Biden into giving him money and has no idea where the money's gone. And we hear that accusation a lot, that there's financial corruption in Ukraine. And surely, I mean, I'm not discounting that, but I'm wondering, like, can we take that at face value, these accusations that we've sent all these billions to Ukraine and there's no accounting for it? In fact, we had a guest in our program about a year ago who was a forensic accountant who actually explained, who actually was able to trace where a lot of the money went, to counter that argument that it's all just kind of disappearing. But I don't know. I just don't know. I don't know. The tweet the president sent was very personally insulting to Zelensky, calling him a second-rate comic or something like that, accusatory of mismanagement. So I'm just, it's been a tough week. It's been a really, really tough week for Ukrainians. So just any thoughts on the claim that America's been swindled essentially by Ukraine? It's hard to, I don't think any of us believe it, but you hear this all the time.
So, Dr. Shrey, let me say one thing. First of all, Zelensky's not a second-rate comic. I've watched his shows, and he's actually a very good comic.
Oh,
So let's get that out of the way right away.
that's sweet.
As for the corruption, the World Bank did a study a few years ago rating countries based on level of corruption and how close they are to meeting standards of being really transparent, etc. On level of corruption, Ukraine ranks around the same area as many new members of NATO in terms of level of corruption. So down with Albania, actually better than Albania, better than like Bosnia and Herzegovina, etc. Is the misuse of funds. And I tend to agree with your forensic accountant, although we're not there to look at it. I would take everything that President Trump is saying right now as trying to shape the negotiating battlefield, or the alternative is he's freaking delusional. Or he's in Putin's back pocket. It's one of the three. He's either trying to shape the negotiating environment, two, he's freaking delusional, or three, he really is Putin's puppet and he really wants to put Trump Tower up in Moscow. So I take him with a grain of salt until we see, because, you know, realistically, U.S. Congress is already coming back at him for the comments. Plenty of people within the Congress, again, this requires our U.S. Congress actually stand up to the president to look at this. I agree there should be an accountability. I think if we were to follow the money, your forensic accountant did love to see the episode. By the way, send me the link to that episode. I'd like to see what he said. Most of the money didn't go directly to Ukraine. It went through, it was given to buy foreign military sales, which would then, from the U.S., to then give the equipment to Ukraine. As far as I know, how much went directly to Kiev and then from Kiev out to other people, I don't know how much, but the bulk of it is for military equipment, which we bought from ourselves and then transferred it.
Yeah.
So that's all. That's my only thought on that.
It's just a hard accusation, and it's one that you hear everywhere. The one that you hear quite often. And then I know that Pete Hegseth announced, I think, at a conference in Germany or something, maybe recently, that the idea of going back to the pre-2014 borders is just off the table and unrealistic. And it's just hard to hear stuff like that. It's just hard to hear a third party determining your future. It's hard to hear a second party determining your future, but it's been a really, really rough week, obviously, is an understatement. And then on the Ukrainian side, I'm actually hearing little bits of hope, like, oh, we just have to hang in there for 3.5 more years. The amount of bloodshed, the amount, like the whole generation is lost. We've had guests on our program who describe what the horrors of being at the front are. And the idea of having to hang in there for 3.5 years is just heartbreaking. I mean, you admire the resolve, but it's hard. It's just hard. It's just hard. So no real question there, more just
Thank you.
Reaction.
Thank you, Katerina. And we have Frank Hickey joining us. Frank, please open your camera and microphone if you hear me.
And the microphone.
Yes, I don't see you. I hear you.
You see me now?
Not yet.
Well, my face isn't that important.
Now we see it. Yes, your face is very important because it's the face of Ukraine if you are there.
Thank you. I spent a year and a half in Ukraine, as you may know, recently working there as a volunteer. And when I hear people talk about corruption, I have to remind myself that I was paid to fight corruption as a detective for a very long time. Like the prostitute said, a lot of amateurs are ruining the business. There is corruption in Ukraine. There's corruption in the Catholic Church. There's corruption in Mexico. If Cuba invaded Mexico to fight corruption, we would fight Cuba. It's that simple. Corruption is not an excuse for bombing babies in hospital beds. Any thoughts about this?
There are no thoughts. We agree with you. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are. But my question was, when was your latest dancing session in Odessa? And what can you tell us about mood in Odessa, if you know?
All right. Along with dancing, Victor, Professor, I was teaching at the police academy about
Yes.
corruption. Being
Yes.
an unusual American detective who could speak honestly about corruption in New York. My last dancing lesson was around Christmas time. I've only been back here a short time from Ukraine, and I taught dancing, four foreign languages, and women's jujitsu to protect the women and the girls in my class against Russian sexual attack, which we know they're using. Having suffered through police academies here, I felt I could contribute something. So that last dancing lesson was just before Christmas when I returned to America, where I am now.
Do you plan to come back?
To Ukraine?
Yes.
At this point, that's up in the air. I'm not quite sure. I sadly believe that Ukraine will be betrayed by America as we're speaking now. I believe that we, America, will betray Ukraine the way England betrayed Czechoslovakia and Austria in the 1930s and left them to Hitler.
Do you know what people in Ukraine think about it?
People in Ukraine are divided. Many are, of course, disgusted with the war. Many of the people I knew are not happy with Zelensky. At the same time, when I ask them what the future is, they say, we will fight. And I agree with that. Even if there is a surrender, we know what happened in World War II and in places like Yugoslavia, Italy, and France. There was continued partisan warfare, despite the fact that the government may have surrendered. I see that same thing happening in Ukraine. The average Ukrainian will not submit to what they see as Russian murderous aggression. They will fight until they die.
This is very important for Americans to hear, and I hope that you're saying it you are saying it for the record. I hope that what you're saying people will hear, because we have no middleman, no news cycle here. We try to get our data straight from
Victor,
Ukraine.
this past week, I gave 8 television interviews here in New York City.
Wonderful.
2 of them last night at the Ukrainian church on East 7th Street to one local reporter and a reporter from Paris, France. So, as I said, 8 interviews in 1 week, and the week is not over yet. So I am talking to people, anyone I can, and speaking and writing, as you know, with journalists and politicians here.
This is wonderful, and we are very honored that you log on to speak to us, because New York is no Huntington, but we both act locally and think way beyond this. Thank you for telling us about the mood in my ancestral Odessa.
You're welcome.
Last question from me. We have been here for an hour already, but we have time, and I don't have our fourth planned speaker now. I have somebody asking questions, but people constantly hear, and we heard even today, that Putin wants this and that. From what you are saying, I gather that Ukrainians are not in the mood to give him what he wants.
Correct. Most of them. I've been surprised, Professor, and by what some people react that way. I never asked these questions of my class. However, some people would tell me what they wanted. Some want to go back to Russian rule. Some do not. I did not go door to door asking the questions, but some people would tell me whether I asked it or not. They tell me things were better, Frank, under the Russian rule. We had better jobs. We had better health care. We did not worry about the future. I don't argue with people. If I wanted to argue with people, Professor, I would get married. But this is just what I took in from some of my friends there.
Thank you, Frank. But when Frank talks about people talking about Russian rule, just for the benefit of our viewers, they're talking about time 40, 30 years ago of the rule that fell apart as a colossus under its own weight. We are not talking about today's Russia, just like when President says that Russia defeated Hitler and Napoleon. We all know that it wasn't Putin who defeated Napoleon or Hitler.
Exactly.
So you cannot claim that it has the same, owns the same history, ideology, or even manpower.
Exactly correct, Professor. And I believe that some of these people are repeating what their parents have told them.
Absolutely.
Because, as you stated, they were not old enough to live under that regime.
They have not. I talked to a lady from Odessa who said that Russia is not that bad, and I asked her, how long have you lived in Russia? And she said indignantly, I always lived in Odessa.
Yes. Welcome to my world, Professor. You understand the difficulties.
I do.
Just
Thank you, Frank. Yes, please, Katerina.
Just to add to the conversation, so I do remember when the Soviet Union dissolved, and I do remember all sorts of like images from the news, and one that struck with me, and I was young back, well, not young, I was probably like late teens, 20, I can't remember, but what I remember, one of the images was there's like a long like bread line, literally like a cliche bread line. And the reporter, Western reporter, was going down interviewing people, how do you feel about this? This is different. This wasn't like this before. And to a person, everyone replied the same. And one like elderly woman put it something like, it's okay. Yes, you're right. We're standing for hours for bread, but we have freedom. I mean, so that's like the again, like that. So what that was like a really like profound moment then, just to kind of balance the folks who are saying now they wish they could return to whatever that. It's just you have to live it to experience it to understand what you're giving up in exchange for what you're getting.
Victor,
Yes.
May I come in here for a minute?
Absolutely, Dr. Clemens, please.
Speaking of corruption, what do you think about the alliance between Trump and Musk and the American Congress and all these billionaires that are standing around Donald Trump and watching their assets gain just in the last couple weeks tremendously? That also is a form of corruption. On the question of balance of payments, why doesn't Ukraine commit whenever there's peace to sell some of those raw materials that they have to the United States? They have to sell them to somebody, and not so bad to have a customer already. One third point before you finally close up, Russia itself is not so secure. Putin, many people in Moscow say, has already lost the war because of the enormous damage that the war has done to Russia itself. And the United States and its Western partners, I think, should simply work for the downfall of Putin and that regime. If we make peace with him now, Ukraine will not get reparations from Russia, and Putin himself will not go before the International Court, Criminal Court. So these are some final thoughts to put our previous discussion in some context. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Clemens. And we cannot cover everything in 1 hour, but it's amazing, or amusing rather, to close on the note of what we haven't heard. For example, we haven't said or remembered such an interesting New York organization as United Nations, which seems to be under cloak of invisibility. I understand that Russia has a veto in Security Council, but nobody says United Nations cannot pass any resolutions anymore. For example, on peace or victory or reparations or international criminals of war and things like this. And on the more light note, depending on what you stand, you see differently. And I just got a mail from a former friend in Central Asia who was worried that we have egg shortages in the United States. I assured him that not only we have eggs, but my neighbor has chickens, so we are safe for the time being. And I think Odessa, which I remember for the great humor, still stands on that, even through 3 years of war, as Frank can tell us much better than myself, because I have not been in Odessa since my young years. But I know that it wasn't for nothing that it was called the third capital of the Russian Empire, after St. Petersburg and Moscow, and the only one which was European-style capital in the south. So we stand with people of Ukraine. We repeat everything that was said on this program and on many others by experts like you 3 years ago, that aggressor is Putin's Russia, that international criminals of war should be brought to justice, and that peace means victory. Without victory, any ceasefire will be only temporary, as a European continent has seen many times. Thank you all for participating in our session today in 156 seminar of this group, Marshall University, West Virginia. Please, Katerina, say a few words in Ukrainian to our viewers. I know we have some.
Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня прощаємося.
Слава Україні!
Героям
слава!
Thank you everyone who participated. It was great, and thank you for your time and expertise and care.
Thank
See you
you.
next week.